Okay guys, so this week we're going to be talking about the digestive system, and then there's going to be a really quick podcast about nutrition and some basics on the breakdown of some of the nutritional elements. So the organs of the digestive system, also called the digestive tract, or also called the alimentary canal, consists of some primary digestive organs and some secondary or accessory digestive organs. Your digestive tract is basically a tube that extends from your mouth to your anus. The accessory organs are separate organs that aid in digestion. It's really responsible for transforming food into chemicals that can be used for your body. There are layers to the digestive tract, 3 of them mostly. The mucosa consists of 3 layers, an inner layer of epithelium, a layer of loose connective tissue, and then a thin layer of smooth muscle. The submucosa is a thicker layer of connective tissue that contains glands, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. And the muscularis layer consists of 2 layers of smooth muscle. The inner layer goes around, and the outer layer runs longitudinally. This layer regularly contracts and relaxes to propel food through the digestive tract. It's a process we call peristalsis. The serosa, the outermost layer, covers the portion of the digestive tract within the peritoneal cavity. The outer cover of the esophagus and the rectum is called the adventitia, but the rest of it is called the serosa. There are layers of visceral peritoneum called mesenteries that suspend the digestive organs within the abdominal cavity and anchor them loosely to the abdominal wall. These mesenteries contain blood vessels, nerves, lymph vessels, and lymph nodes that supply the digestive tract. The greater omentum is a portion of the mesentery that extends from the greater curvature of the stomach, which is really the lower curve of the stomach, and we're going to see that in a minute. It hangs down over the small intestines, kind of like an apron or a curtain. Deposits of fat give this kind of a lacy appearance. And then the mesocolon fixes the colon to the posterior abdominal wall, or the back of the abdominal wall. I just talked about the greater omentum, the one that hangs from the greater curvature of the stomach down over the small intestines. There's also a lesser omentum that extends from the lesser curvature of the stomach, which is really the top part. It's this part right here of the stomach. This is the greater curvature. The lesser omentum extends from the lesser curve of the stomach to the liver. So it actually goes up, it doesn't hang down. The mouth, also called the oral cavity or the buccal, B-U-C-C-A-L cavity. The tongue is a skeletal muscle covered by a mucous membrane. It's skeletal because it's voluntary. You can control what your tongue does. There's a fold of mucous membrane called the lingual frenulum. I have trouble with those words too. This is what anchors the tongue to the floor of the mouth. The hard palate is the roof of your mouth. It's formed by portions of the maxilla and the palatine bones. Separates the mouth from the nasal cavity. And then the soft palate is more towards the back. That's mostly skeletal muscles that forms an arch between the mouth and the nasopharynx. The cone-shaped process called the uvula is what hangs downward from the soft palate. Or I saw a sitcom on TV one time, they called it the little hangy ball thing. Salivary glands secrete saliva, kind of makes sense. Saliva is a clear fluid, consists mostly of water, but it also has some mucus. It's got an enzyme that kills bacteria. It's got some other antibacterial compounds, some electrolytes, and 2 digestive enzymes. There's 3 different main types of salivary glands. I'm not going to expect you to know those 3 different kinds, but I do want you to know that enzymes contained in saliva are what begin the digestion process. So digestion really begins in your mouth. Amylase breaks down the starch, and lipase begins the digestion of fat. The primary goal is to moisten and soften the food so it can be swallowed easily. Teeth. Digestion begins when food enters the mouth and it's chewed. Chewing is also known as mastication. Chewing allows the food to become moistened with saliva. An adult has 32 permanent teeth, most adults. There are incisors. They have the sharp edges for cutting food, the canine teeth for tearing food, and then the premolars and molars have the large flat surfaces for crushing or grinding. I'm not going to expect you to know all those numbers of which is the first, second, and third. Just know that there are 32 of them, and they help to break up food. The structure of a tooth, there's the enamel, this part here, part of the crown, the neck. The root and the crown meet at the gum line. That's called the neck. The root is embedded in the socket in the jawbone. The enamel covers the crown. It's a hard tissue. The bulk of the tooth is a firm yellowish tissue called dentin. The pulp cavity contains a mass of connective tissue, blood, and lymph vessels, and nerves. It's called pulp. Pulp also fills the root canals of each root. A periodontal ligament lines the sockets. Fibers from the ligament infiltrate both the root and the socket to anchor the tooth in place. There's a connective tissue called cementum that covers the dentin in the root. And nerves and blood vessels enter the tooth through an opening at the tail of the root canal. The pharynx. After food's been broken down by the teeth and moistened by saliva, the tongue manipulates the food, the bolus, that's what it's called as you chew it. It's actually this little green blob here. The bolus of food manipulates it to the back of the oral cavity. Then the soft palate lifts, which closes off the nasopharynx. The larynx rises, which forces the epiglottis over the trachea, because you don't want food going down your trachea into your lungs. You want it through the oropharynx and laryngopharynx on its way to the esophagus. The esophagus is what connects the pharynx to the stomach. There's a muscular sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter that helps prevent the backflow of stomach acid into the esophagus. That's right here. There's probably a couple other names for it. Glands within the wall of the esophagus secrete mucus that also helps to lubricate the food bolus as it passes through. When the bolus enters the esophagus, it triggers the wave-like muscular contractions. Remember those two layers of muscles that contract to move food through, called peristalsis, that helps push the food towards the stomach. The stomach is a muscular sac. Its primary function is to store food, not to digest it like most people think. It prepares food for digestion, but most of the digestion actually occurs in the intestines. The food contracts and churns the food. The stomach contracts and churns the food to break it into small particles and to mix it with gastric juice. The resulting semi-fluid mixture is called chyme, and that's spelled C-H-Y-M-E. Chyme leaves the stomach and enters the duodenum by passing through the pyloric sphincter right here. The normal curvature of the stomach creates two landmarks. The lesser curvature, we had just talked about this when we talked about the omentums, the lesser curvature, or the smaller one at the top, and then the greater curvature, or the larger curve, at the bottom. The stomach's divided into four regions. The cardia, which is right here, the fundus, which is the top, the body, which is the biggest part of it, and then the pylorus down here, which is why this sphincter right here is called the pyloric sphincter. The stomach contains the same layers. This one. Stomach contains the same layers as the rest of the digestive tract. Remember the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and the serosa. The one difference, though, is that for the stomach, the muscularis layer has an extra layer of oblique muscle between the other two layers, between the one that goes around and the one that goes longitudinal. So the stomach has 3 layers of muscle. That extra layer allows the stomach to contract and churn vigorously as it processes the food. When the stomach is empty, the mucosa and submucosa wrinkle into folds called rugae, R-U-G-A-E. This allows the stomach to shrink down, and then it allows it to expand when it fills with food. Within the stomach are things called gastric pits. It's in the gastric mucosa. They're depressions or pits. There's several different glands called gastric glands that open into the bottom of each of these gastric pits. These glands secrete the various components of the gastric juice. These can secrete up to 3 liters of gastric juice a day. Mucus cells secrete mucus. It kind of makes sense. This protects the stomach lining and keeps the stomach from digesting itself. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is what's necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12. Hydrochloric acid helps kill microbes in swallowed food. Chief cells secrete the digestive enzymes like pepsinogen, and then enteroendocrine cells secrete the hormone ghrelin, G-H-R-E-L-I-N, that stimulates the hypothalamus to increase your appetite, and gastrin, which influences digestive function. So I talked about chyme. So swallowing signals the stomach to relax so the food can enter. Once the food enters, there's like three things that happen. Contractions starting in the fundus move towards the pyloric region. They start out gentle, progressively get stronger. Wave-like peristaltic contractions break down the food and mix it with the gastric juices to form the chyme. The chyme moves towards the pyloric sphincter. It's propelled by all those contractions of the stomach. Under pressure of a contraction, about 30 mL of chyme squirts into the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine. The stomach continues to churn and mix its contents as it gradually releases the chyme into the duodenum. This continues until the stomach empties, which can take about 4 hours following a typical meal. The liver. Liver is the body's largest gland. Now, I know I said with the endocrine system the thyroid was the largest endocrine gland. That's true. The liver is not an endocrine gland, but it is the gland because it secretes substances. But it is the body's largest gland. It's got 4 lobes. 2 of the lobes can be seen from the front or the anterior view. Those are the right and left lobes. These lobes are separated by the falciform ligament that also serves to anchor the liver to the abdominal wall. The liver performs really over 250 tasks. It's a very busy little organ. Remember when we talked about endocrine and it's stimulated to release glycogen to convert it into glucose and secrete it into the bloodstream in response to low blood sugars. It also converts glucose into glycogen. It processes vitamins and minerals. It filters toxins. It recycles all blood cells. It's pretty busy. The lobes of the liver that are seen from the posterior view or from behind are the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe. The portal vein carries oxygen-poor but nutrient-rich blood from the digestive organs and the spleen to the liver. The hepatic artery delivers oxygenated blood from the aorta to the liver, because remember, arteries go away from the heart. So the hepatic artery is going to bring lots of oxygen from the heart to the liver. The portal vein veins carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So the portal vein will carry oxygen poor but lots of nutrients from the digestive organs and spleen to the liver. There are lobules inside your liver called hepatic lobules. These fill the inside of your liver. There's a central vein that passes through the core of each one. Sheets of hepatic cells called hepatocytes fan out from the center of the lobule, and in between these sheets of cells are passageways that are filled with blood. These passageways are called sinusoids. Tiny canals called caniculi carry the bile that are secreted by the hepatocytes. So the nutrient-rich blood from the stomach and intestine enters the lobule through the small branches of the portal vein. Oxygen-rich blood enters the lobule through small branches of the hepatic artery. The blood filters through the sinusoids, allowing the cells to remove nutrients as well as hormones, toxins, and drugs. And at the same time, the liver secretes substances like clotting factors, albumin, angiotensinogen, and glucose into the blood for distribution throughout the body. There are phagocytic cells called Kupffer cells, that's K-U-P-F-F-E-R. These cells remove bacteria, worn out red blood cells, and other debris from the bloodstream. The central vein carries the processed blood out of the liver. Canaliculi, carry the bile secreted by hepatic cells and ultimately drain into the right and left hepatic ducts. The gallbladder. The gallbladder is attached to the underside of the liver. It stores and concentrates bile. It does not produce bile, it just stores and concentrates it. It's about 3 to 4 inches long, and it holds between 30 and 50 mL of bile. Bile leaves the liver by the right and left hepatic ducts. These two ducts converge to form the common hepatic duct, which then goes on to become the common bile duct. Bile from the liver first fills the common bile duct before backing up into the gallbladder through the cystic duct. The bile duct merges with the duct of the pancreas to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the ampulla of Vater, V-A-T-E-R. The ampulla enters the duodenum at a raised area called the major duodenal papilla, and then a sphincter called the hepatopancreatic sphincter, or the sphincter of Oddi, O-D-D-I, controls the flow of bile and pancreatic juice into the duodenum. Bile contains bilirubin and bile salts. Bilirubin is from the breakdown of hemoglobin, and the bile salts, one of the main functions in digestion is to aid in the digestion and absorption of fat. Hopefully we're going to get to do an experiment that shows, kind of illustrates the breakdown of fat. The pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. Remember we talked about it with the endocrine gland. This endocrine function centers on the pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans. Those are the ones that secrete insulin and glucagon. But most of the pancreas is the exocrine tissue. Each day it secretes about 1.5 liters of pancreatic juice, which is essentially digestive enzymes and an alkaline fluid, into the small intestine. Acinar cells, A-C-I-N-A-R, cells secrete digestive enzymes in an inactive form. Once activated in the duodenum, the enzymes help break down lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Duct cells secrete sodium bicarbonate, which buffers the highly acidic chyme entering the duodenum from the stomach. The ducts converge on the main pancreatic duct, which then joins the bile duct at the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the ampulla of Vater, V-A-T-E-R. The small intestine. This is where most of the chemical digestion and nutrient absorption takes place. The duodenum is the first 10 inches, begins at the pyloric valve of the stomach. We talked about that with the stomach. The duodenum, it shows right here. The duodenum receives the chyme from the stomach, as well as the pancreatic juice and the bile from the pancreas and the liver. This is where the stomach acid is neutralized and the pancreatic enzymes begin the chemical digestion. And again, most digestive processes occur here. The jejunum is the next 8 feet. It's pointing to right here. It's the next, I think it comes up here and probably circles around. It's the next 8 feet of the small intestine. There's a lot of large, closely spaced folds, millions of microscopic projections that give the jejunum an enormous surface area. This makes it an ideal location for nutrient absorption. That's where most of it happens. The ileum is the last 12 feet of your small intestine, so you've got about almost 21 feet of intestine through a small intestine throughout your abdominal cavity. So it's got this pictured as the jejunum, which actually looks bigger in this picture than the ileum, which is more the larger part of your small intestines. The wall of the ileum is thinner, it's got less blood. There are clusters of lymphatic nodules called Peyer's patches scattered throughout the ileum. Intestinal contractions, they are what help the small intestine break down food particles, mix food with the digestive juices, and then bring the digested food in contact with the mucosa so that the nutrients can be absorbed. These contractions also propel food residue toward the large intestine. There's 2 types of intestinal contractions, segmentation and peristalsis. Peristalsis we've already talked about. That's where most of the nutrients have been absorbed, undigested residue remains. They're like successive wave-like ripples that move the digestive material along the gastrointestinal tract. Segmentation involves ring-like constrictions that occur at intervals along the small intestine. When the first contracted areas relax, new contractions occur in other locations. This back and forth movement breaks up food particles and kneads the contents of the intestines, mixing it with the digestive juices. The intestinal lining contains multiple projections that increase its surface area, enhancing the absorption of nutrients. There's also circular folds that slow the progress of chyme, and increase its contact with the mucosa. On top of the circular folds are projections called villi. So you can see here the circular folds kind of look circular, and then all these projections here that increase the surface area. The villi are covered by absorptive epithelial cells and mucus-secreting goblet cells. There's an arteriole, a venule, and a lymph vessel called a lacteal that fill the core of each of these villi. Epithelial cells covering the villi have a brush border of ultrafine microvilli. These increase the absorptive area and produce digestive enzymes. And pores at the bases of the villi, called intestinal crypts, contain goblet cells that secrete mucus that helps the passage of food. They also serve as sites for rapid cellular growth, producing new cells to replace those that are shed from the villi. Chemical digestion and absorption, and remember this, most of this is what happens inside the small intestines, uses digestive enzymes. It transforms food into particles that can be absorbed, breaks it down into little teeny pieces. Like I said, it occurs mostly in the small intestine, and it varies depending on what nutrient is being digested and being absorbed. Carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth with amylase. I said that earlier. It continues in the small intestine with pancreatic amylase, and then it finishes at the villi with sucrase, lactase, and maltase. And it's a digestive enzyme if it ends in ASE. So carbohydrates consist of sugars called saccharides. There's polysaccharides, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. Most foods contain polysaccharides, which must be broken down into smaller particles. So the amylase in the saliva breaks down the polysaccharides into disaccharides. The low pH of stomach acid, however, inactivates that salivary amylase. By the time the food gets into your stomach, about 50% of the starch has already been broken down. In the small intestine, chyme mixes with pancreatic amylase, and then starch digestion resumes. So there's no starch digestion in your stomach. It's only in your mouth and then in your small intestine. The final steps occur at the level of the villi. The membranes of the epithelial cells that cover the villi contain the enzymes sucrase, lactase, and maltase. So as chyme slides against this border, that brush border that the villi have, the enzymes bind with the disaccharides. This is when they bind as they make contact. It's called contact digestion. This final step in the digestion process produces the glucose, which is immediately absorbed. Protein digestion, on the other hand, begins in the stomach with pepsin, and then it continues in the duodenum with the trypsin and the chymotrypsin, and finishes in the small intestine with the peptidases. Before the body can, remember proteins are made of amino acids, before the body can absorb those amino acids, those peptide bonds need to be broken. Enzymes called proteases are what do that. They're not found in saliva. They work in the stomach and the small intestine. In the stomach, it's pepsin that breaks apart the peptide bonds between certain amino acids. But when the chyme enters the duodenum, the pepsin is inactivated. Then the pancreatic enzymes, trypsin and chymotrypsin, take over the job of breaking apart the peptide bonds. And then brush border enzymes, again, like brush border things broke down the disaccharides. Brush border enzymes called peptidases break the remaining chains into individual amino acids that are then absorbed into the bloodstream. Fat digestion. Fat digestion first requires emulsification that continues in the small intestine with pancreatic lipase. When a fat globule enters the duodenum, two substances in bile, lecithin and bile salts, break up the fat into small droplets. That's what's called the emulsification. Once it's emulsified, pancreatic lipase, which is the main fat digesting enzyme, begins to digest the fat. Fats are broken down into a mixture of glycerol, short-chain fatty acids, long-chain fatty acids, and monoglycerides. Glycerol and short-chain fatty acids are absorbed into the bloodstream of the villi. The long-chain fatty acids and monoglycerides, they're really too large to be absorbed by the capillaries are absorbed into the walls of the villi. There, they're changed into triglycerides and eventually enter the lacteal of the villi. They travel through the lymphatic system and enter the bloodstream at the left subclavian vein. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the large intestine. Once food has been processed and all the nutrients are absorbed that the body wants, the body can get, the remaining residue enters the large intestine. The large intestine is where the majority of water absorption happens. Your large intestine absorbs large amounts of water before passing the resulting waste material, also known as feces, out of the body. It begins in a blind pouch called the cecum. You can see it right here. There is a valve called the ileocecal valve right there. Its job is to make sure things don't go back into the ileum from the cecum. And at the end of the cecum is the appendix, this little thing right here. That contains a bunch of lymphoid tissue. It serves as a source for immune cells. Although a lot of people have had their appendix out, it can get inflamed and need to be removed. The ascending colon, right here, extends up towards the liver, hence the name ascending. It makes a sharp turn at the right colic or hepatic flexure, so it goes up and then it hangs right. There it becomes the transverse colon because it goes across your body. It passes below the liver, the stomach, and the spleen, and then it hangs a quick right and goes downward. It hangs a quick right at the left colic or the splenic flexure. The descending colon extends downward along the left side of the abdominal cavity. The sigmoid colon forms an S shape down to the rectum. This part here is kind of an S shape. It's a little hard to see. And then the rectum is the last 7 or 8 inches of the intestine. The anal canal, which makes up the last inch of the rectum, opens to the exterior through the anus. In the anus, there are 2 sphincters, an internal and an external. The internal sphincter is involuntary smooth muscle, and then the external is voluntary skeletal muscle, and that's how you pass the stool out. So to summarize, we've talked about the entire digestive system, that giant tube that goes from your mouth to your anus, the different stages of digestion and the different ways different substances are digested and by what enzymes. We're going to do hopefully a little experiment where we're going to digest some things and see how the texture of it changes, and try to relate that to how it changes inside your body. And that's it.